Hello, and welcome to Nalco's Customer Experience Center, based in Naperville, Illinois, which is a far west suburb of Chicago. This facility is really used for training with customers and our internal teams and sharing best practices and various topics. We've also had various departments of health and the CDC Legionella Task Force at this facility sharing risk mitigation practices. Today's webinar will go through introductions, but is really on the topic of the Senate Bill 2188 that New Jersey just passed. So I'm going to head over to our area and I'll talk a little bit about the rules of engagement with the presenters, myself and another peer. So all the microphones have been muted and cameras have been turned off. If you'd like to speak or actually talk to the presenters, there's a Q&A button at the very top that would allow you to submit a question. We're going to submit questions and review them at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'd like to ask my peer to come up, co-presenter Eric, and we're going to go through these slides and go through the introduction of both of ourselves. So Eric, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks a lot, Steve, and welcome everybody. My name is Eric Myers, and I've been a technical consultant here at Naco Water since about the year, 1997, coming up in 25 years. And so I'll get into my talk here later today, but I focus on water safety strategies around Legionella and pathogens.
Well, thanks, Eric. My name is Steve Spiewak. I've been with the company about 28 years, and I'm going to go through the first section and introduce our agenda and the first few topics of the Senate Bill 2188. So I put this slide together really to kind of think through, right, how legislation is happening across the U.S. If you take a look at these three topics, it'll probably resonate with you. Many of you may recall when we didn't have legislation around some of these topics, like fire safety, around child restraints, or even seat belts. And today, if you were to see somebody with an infant in a car that wasn't, placed in a car seat, you'd probably say something, right? It's kind of that habitual practice of legislation and implementing something that we're not used to recognize it. It can be difficult, it can be challenging at times, and that's how these new regulations really come about and how we want to kind of begin to start working on this to make it a habitual practice within your facilities. So again, don't wait necessarily. It's always best to move forward quickly and to begin the process of risk mitigation practices so that it becomes more of a habitual practice within your facilities. So thankfully, the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection started with very broad legislation. So we really compliment what they've done. And it's not too prescriptive. So it makes it easy for the building owner to actually implement these regulations. So today we're going to go through three areas. We're going to talk about the overview of the New Jersey Senate bill. We'll talk about the various aspects of it, timelines, things like that. And then what are those key requirements for those building owners? Eric Myers, who you were introduced to earlier, is going to go into the detail of one of the key aspects, which is a requirement of the water management program based on ASHRAE 188. And then we'll open it up for Q&A and we'll talk through various questions that may be submitted. Again, as a reminder, there is a Q&A button at the very top that you can submit questions through. We'll try to get to all those questions at the end of the presentation. If we don't get through all of your questions, we'll try to follow up you after the webinar. So let's get into Senate Bill 2188. So it was passed. So this is not something that is still being proposed. The Senate bill was passed. This next bullet point that you see on your screen is actually verbatim from the legislation. It requires the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health, owners and operators of certain public community water systems, and owners and operators of certain buildings or facilities to take certain actions to prevent and control cases of Legionnaire's disease. That's pretty broad. Right? But beware, there is some misinformation from self-interest groups that are making it out into social media and inaccurate statements. One of those was that this ASSC certification was required. That is not true. There's no certification requirements other than basing the water management plan on the ASHRAE Standard 188 and CDC best practices. So this first slide really takes a step back and looks at from a perspective of the initial aspects, right? These public community water systems have to maintain residuals of, whether it be chlorine or chloramine. And that has to be throughout the active system. Now, there's nothing in this in the legislation right now that talks about what action can people take, but these public community water systems have to have this requirement to maintain the residual. So there's more to come. There'll be more follow-up to this legislation. It also provides the Department of Health and inspectors the authority to prescribe actions to incidences. So the DEP shall, within 12 months, give guidance on these water management best practices to minimize pathogen and bacteria growth. Within 24 months, they'll provide awareness and tools and tracking for disruptions. If there's a water main break, there's going to be a method for communicating that out and documenting it. Within 24 months, they'll adopt rules and requirements to minimize Legionella bacteria growth. There'll be established penalties for not meeting those requirements, i.e. these disinfectant levels. And then it also requires a data management system to track this disruption and the testing data. Now, this is 24 months to be built, right? These various things that the DEP must do. So that's why the legislation is creating, there's a lot of time now to actually have all these things happen and actually get created. So there is going to be more to come around this legislation. The other key aspects, right, is the legislation outlines the kind of critical aspects for the Department of Health and local health officers to follow for investigation and identifying the source, right? So whether that be the disruption or the source of infection, they now have that kind of outline and guidelines on how to do that. Now, what's really important is within 24 months, owners and operators of the buildings shall develop a water management program, and you typically see this acronym as a WMP, per ASHRAE Standard 188, which includes these various facilities. Now, you'll notice in here there's some healthcare related facilities. A lot of those are already covered through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services requirements for Legionella management. But these now expand into further buildings across New Jersey. If you have questions on this can sometimes be a little bit confusing, so don't hesitate to reach out to a NALCO representative and we can get more clarification for you. But just to go through a few things, the one point I want to talk about is this building containing or on property and at-risk system as defined shall have a water management program for that system and not the entire building. So you may find that there might be an at-risk water system that the plan should be addressing only. You don't have to have a plan for the entire building if you don't have all those types of at-risk water systems. You'll learn a little bit more about those definitions when my co-presenter goes through the details of a water management program. Other aspects of the legislation says that testing shall include but not limited to Legionella pneumophila in a manner consistent with DOH guidance and ASHRAE Standard 188. Positive test results should follow guidelines and best practices that are out there. And again, basing the water management program on ASHRAE 188 and CDC best practices, you'll find that there are places where you have remediation and actions and verification and validation steps. It's all in that water management program when you follow the ASHRAE model. Reporting of positive test results have to be reported based on DOH guidance and a system provided, right? So right now, there's not a portal to input those test results, but in the neighboring town in New York City and New York State, right, they have portals. So many of you are probably familiar with that. It's probably going to be a similar type of system for New Jersey. Also posting awareness of the building's water management program, right? This is a little different. It has to be easily accessed. So a building, when they have a water management program, is going to have to post that awareness. And then there are citations. You see here $2,000 for the first violation, $5,000 second violation, and so on when there's serious injuries or death. So you'll see this in legislation, and we've seen this across the U.S. There is a legislation in this link. So for those of you that are looking for the presentation or a copy of the presentation, you can reach out to your NALCO counterparts to receive a copy. That is really the overview of the legislation. You notice there 24 months, right? And I want to go back to this when I had that slide up talking about like seatbelt buckle legislation and car seats and things. When you think about 24 months, it may seem like a lot of time. Understand that exercising and practicing something new that you're going to learn about here shortly, it takes time to do that. And again, I want to compliment the New Jersey DEP for setting it up for success, giving that time to create the water management program and implementing it. And so with that, I'd like to call Eric Myers back up and to go through what the details are around a water management program. So Eric, I'll step off and pass it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Steve. So what I'm going to get into here today is talking about, give you some key insights on water management programs and some of the key requirements that you're going to need to pay attention to. So before we get started, I want to go through some general background information around why is this important. Legionella risk is very important because people become ill and sickened by it. And it really comes down to protecting what matters most, and that is people and the brand of your company. If your company goes out of business, a lot of people will lose their jobs. If people get sick and die, that's tragic, and we don't want that to happen. So this is all about preventing those bad situations from occurring. Also think about the potential economic impact. Not only could there be fines issued, as Steve pointed out, from the new bill, but think about if somebody sues you, what the average settlement is. We have seen settlements per case, per individual, anywhere from $250,000 up to $5.2 million per settlement. And also, if they shut down your building, what could that mean to you in your daily production or your organization for being shut down? It's kind of ironic, about a month or two ago, maybe it's been a couple months, but there's a building here in Chicago that closed because they found Legionella in their water system. It happened to be the US EPA, which I find kind of ironic. So you might be thinking, how does this bacteria get into our building water systems? And probably one of the primary sources is the water coming from the city water supply, the public water utility. Even though water is treated to a standard per EPA drinking water rules, it does not necessarily eradicate or prevent Legionella from occurring in water systems, because that's not an indicator organism to prevent dysentery or gastroenteritis associated with, say, with coliforms and E. coli or other types of enterics from animals. So bacteria like Legionella can survive some of those treatment techniques at very low numbers and eventually gets into your building through that route. If it gets all the way up to your water main and survives that passage through the network of piping. Another way is through water main breaks or construction events. And obviously a water main break is a breach in the system, and it's going to get entrained with sediment and dirt and bacteria. So that's another way. Construction events. Anytime you disrupt the public water supply coming into your building, you create a pressure shock. And a lot of times those pressure shocks will dislodge sediments. And that's another type of event that you need to be aware of. And if you know these events are happening external to your property, you can maintain some awareness to look for the changing water quality conditions, and you can respond to it. But think about this. Even if water that meets EPA requirements can have some bacteria, up to 500 bacteria per milliliter of water. That's a lot of bacteria on a per gallon basis. If you use 5,000 gallons of water, you could potentially have up to 9.5 billion bacteria passing through your building every day. So amongst that large population, there could be a subset of Legionella, other types of waterborne pathogens like Pseudomonas that could get into your building, and then under the right conditions, it could grow. Now let's take a step back. That this term Legionella bacteria, Legionellosis, may be common and understood by many people here on this webinar here today, but maybe not. So we'll take a brief moment to take a pause and go over some fundamental basics. What is Legionella bacteria, and what disease does it cause? And it causes an illness known as Legionellosis. There's really two forms of illness. The form of illness you don't want to get is Legionnaire's disease. And that's a lung infection and causes bacterial pneumonia. The issue with this type of illness is an atypical pneumonia, which means it presents very differently from typical pneumonias. Hospitalization is common. The onset of symptoms is anywhere from 2 to 14 days after exposure, again, contingent upon the dose and your individual susceptibility. So immunocompromised people or people with comorbidities are more susceptible. The number of cases each year is probably severely underestimated, but from what we know and what the US CDC knows is anywhere from 8,000 to 18,000 cases per year, likely very much underreported. And then those who get Legionnaire's disease or become sickened, 1 in 10 people will die from it. So a case fatality rate of about 10%. Now, another form of illness, Legionnaire's disease is primarily caused by Legionella pneumophila serogroup 1. And if you've never heard of that, what a serogroup is, it's kind of like a bacteria fingerprint. And within pneumophila, there are 15 fingerprints, 15 serogroups. But the primary one that causes Legionnaire's disease is serogroup 1. There are other species of Legionella, up to 60 some, 70 some. There's a lot that's continued to be discovered. But some of those cause a less severe form of illness. You feel like you have the common cold. And onset is anywhere from 2 to 3 days. You feel like you have the common cold. And typically it's self-limiting, and hospitalization is very much uncommon unless you have other underlying conditions. So the general facts about Legionella is that you have to inhale it as an aerosol. It has to get into your lungs because it causes a bacterial pneumonia. Now, other ways of getting bacteria into your lungs is through aspiration. Say you're eating ice chips that are contaminated or drinking water that happens to be contaminated. You have to aspirate it into your lungs. Now, if you drink the water and you don't aspirate it, it's not going to affect you at all. It doesn't cause a gastrointestinal illness. It's also not considered contagious from person to person. At least the evidence is not supporting that at this time. Now, if you look at Legionnaire's disease over the course of history, it's been around a long time. They believe it's been around since the 1950s. It really didn't emerge and became known until 1976 during the Legionnaire's Convention in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. But if you looked at some information published by the CDC, is that the trend is still going up. Between 2000 and 2021, the trend was fourfold increase over that 10-year period. I'm sure that continues to this day. And we're hoping to get some updated information from the CDC soon. They had to take a pause during COVID. So why is this? Why are things still going up? Well, I think it comes down to, and many experts in the industry feel that it comes down to greater awareness of this disease, better testing capabilities by the medical community, also aging population, aging infrastructure, and also water conservation measures. So putting in automatic faucets to save water is somewhat antithetical to the purpose of a water management program, because you want to use water. You want to maintain chlorine residuals, maintain proper water temperatures, and prevent water age. So that kind of goes against you. Now, another question you may have are, what are the common sources as far as cases are linked to what kinds of systems? So there's a study by US CDC. It came out in 2016. And lo and behold, it's potable water. That's the number one occurrence. 56% of the cases are connected to a potable hot water system in general, because hot water temperatures, if they're not properly managed correctly, could be in a growth range that really supports Legionella. So if you have your temperatures between 95 and 105 degrees, that's the perfect zone for Legionella growth. Cooling towers, everybody thinks that's the number one source, and in reality, it's not, by more than half. And the reason it kind of makes the headlines, right? We're going to talk about what happened in 2015 in New York City. And there was a big outbreak at that time. It got everybody's attention. It made the press, made the news, made national news. And for that reason, the perception is it's cooling towers that are always linked to disease, when in reality, it's your potable water systems you really have to pay attention to. Not saying you don't pay attention to others, but that's the number one issue. Then there's other systems like whirlpool spas, ornamental water features, decorative water features, and misting systems. And if you do a quick Google search on whirlpool spas and cruise ships, there's an ongoing investigation into cruise ships right now as being linked to a source of an outbreak. So if you look at the industry trends, this has always been trending, but I'm going to kind of give you a snapshot of what's been going on for the last 10 years. And in 2014, the VHA, the Veterans Health Administration, published a directive called 1061. And it's a policy that requires VA medical centers to implement a water management program for Legionella and other pathogens, as well as scald risk control measures. And that really kind of got the attention of the medical community outside of the VA healthcare system, that they really needed to start paying attention to this. Then shortly thereafter, a year later, I sit on the ASHRAE committee as a voting member, and the committee published ASHRAE Standard 188, and that talks about what are the elements of a water management program and plan? What elements need to be included in that plan? It doesn't talk about any of the strategies for managing risk. It just says, if you're going to have a plan, here are the basics and the fundamentals that you need to have included. And then shortly after publication, it's kind of like the perfect storm scenario. The event of the cooling tower outbreak in New York City occurred. And as you know, hundreds of people were sickened, and the case fatality rate was right around 10-12%. So in alignment with previous data. And that led to the regulations in New York City and New York State for cooling towers. You got to have a water management plan per 188. You need to have your towers registered. You need to have a cleaning and disinfection procedures established. And you need to do Legionella testing every 90 days while the system is in operation. Then about 2 years later, CMS, stands for Centers for Medicaid Services, which regulates Medicare and the Medicare programs for healthcare. And if an organization wants to participate and receive funding through CMS, they have to follow certain rules. And one of the rules that came out was QSO 17-30, which specifies that healthcare organizations need to have a water management program to manage Legionella risk, as well as other opportunistic waterborne pathogens. So that came out, and that really pushed the market along. And then, of course, accreditation agencies followed close behind that, and they are now looking for these elements that you have them established in your healthcare setting. In 2020, ASHRAE guideline was finally refreshed. The original publication of that was in 2000. So it took us 20 years later to get to it. And we finally refreshed that and released it in 2020. And it supports 188. It's good insights on the strategies, the procedures that you can follow, that you can put into your water management plan and how to mitigate this risk. And then finally, what Steve just talked about for you guys in the state of New Jersey, SB 2188 just came out. So you might be thinking, wow, this seems pretty complicated. Where do I start? And it really starts with procuring a copy of 188 and Guideline 12. Go to the ASHRAE website and get yourself a copy, and that'll give you everything you're probably going to need to know, including going to the CDC website. They have a nice toolkit. Between that information, you have all the tools available to you to develop a water management plan. When you look inside 188, I talked about the elements. These are the basic 7 elements that need to be part of your plan. It kind of gives you the backbone structure for developing it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this in some more detail here and kind of give you the insights of what each of these elements means. So one of the first things you're going to want to do is organize a team. Who is going to be responsible for the implementation, the creation of the plan, and following the plan? So you're going to have a team of different disciplines that could be part of that team, from engineering, health and safety, epidemiology if you're in healthcare, infection prevention, EVS or environmental services, housekeeping and hotels. So you might have a diverse team, and it might be 1 or 2 people for very small sites. It might be 5 to 10 people for very large sites like healthcare settings. But first and foremost, there needs to be a responsible person appointed who owns that program, owns the plan, to make sure that all the responsible parties are doing their jobs to follow the plan and do the things that you said and outlined in your plan. The next thing you need to do, once you establish your team, is you need to describe your water systems. What do you have? How many cold water main connections do you have? Are any of those water mains connected between each other? And does that connection hold stagnant water? Something you need to manage. How many hot water systems do you have? Are they centralized, circulated in a loop, serving multiple floors or areas? Or are they point of use water heaters, serving a few outlets? So the first thing you want to do is understand your systems, and you create a simple line diagram. Where does water come in? Receiving. Number 2, how is that cold water distributed? Where does it go to? The potable water services, including to non-potable utility service, such as makeup to boilers and cooling towers. How is water heated, right? We want to have hot water. We like to wash our hands in warm water or take a shower in warm water, preferably. So how do you create hot water? Are the systems centralized? Do they have water storage? Are they circulated in a loop? Or are they go out to a single point of use with no circulation? So those are the things you're trying to dig into to understand where the risks are. And that takes us to step 3. Once you identify and understand what systems you have and you create this simple line diagram, you then want to go through an exercise of identifying the systems for potential hazards. So where at different ways that water is processed and flowing through your building could a hazard occur? So if you look at the box that's circled in red, what are some of the external hazards? Meaning you receive water from the city water supply. What are the external hazards? Well, if there's a water main break, a bunch of crud or sediments could come into your building during that excursion event. It's something that if you can catch it, to be aware of, because it may lead to the requirement for flushing things. Where are the points of exposure? How is water used? So a point of exposure would be like a shower, which is the highest point of exposure for people using water because you're intimately in contact with that water during that showering event. What about water temperatures and stagnation? These things kind of go together. One, for water temperatures, for cold water, you want to keep it cold, right? That's through water turnover. For hot water systems, you want to make sure your hot water systems are at the proper set points and not at set points that are going to support Legionella growth. And we want to avoid stagnation and dead legs. So you can use this process flow to help you identify where these potential hazard points are. And there could be special considerations in healthcare, such as ice machines, because ice is served to patients for various types of care. The fourth thing you need to do is define control measures and establish how you're going to monitor those control measures. So control measures are limits. What are you going to maintain cold water temperatures to? Now, you can't chill the water, or typically we don't chill the water unless your site is in Dubai, which I happened to visit earlier this year, and they do chill their water in that part of the world because they're in a desert environment. So it is possible, and they maintain their cold water at 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees centigrade. Understandably, cold water may not be feasible to maintain in warmer environments. I suspect in the state of New Jersey, it's much easier than it is, say, in Las Vegas. Hot water systems is about keeping it hot. Stored hot water should be stored at 140 and use temperature mixing valves to help temper that water for distribution. And the idea is to deliver water up to the outlet at or above 120 degrees. Obviously, we got to guard against scald risk, and we got to balance that. It's kind of a catch-22, but we have to look at what can we do that's feasible, because you can put scald control risks into place at the points of use. That way you could deliver water up to 120 degrees up to the outlet. The other thing that's important is keeping water moving. You need to keep water turned over. Water age prevention is a big factor into a program and understanding when these events occur so that you can implement procedures for flushing at certain times of year or for certain areas of a building that's just not getting a lot of water use. So keep it moving, because it does one thing is to maintain temperatures and fresh chlorine residual that happens to be coming in from the city water supply, given that you're receiving something that's sufficient and can be managed. And the next aspect is keep it clean, right? We don't want shower heads to get scaled up, clogged up with scale and biofilms. We need to clean our cooling towers on a regular basis because they are an excellent air scrubber, and they need to be cleaned out because it does build up with sediment and sludge. So bottom line, keep it cold, keep it hot, keep things moving, and keep it clean. Now you've established control measures and control limits. Now you need to establish how you're going to monitor them, because you need to gauge how well you're performing in maintaining the water quality within those limits. So what are you going to do around water temperatures? Well, when it comes to a hot water system, you should be checking your hot water supply, return, mixed water temperatures from water heaters, anywhere from daily to weekly. Sometimes monthly is enough. What about water temperatures from points of use? How well is water being used around the building? Do you have any areas that are low use? And that's a combination of water temperature. And the second one here is disinfectant residual, because there's two things that you have at your disposal for mitigation: temperature and disinfectant residual. And without those, you want those to help suppress the ability of bacteria to grow. It won't necessarily kill it unless water temperatures get very hot, but it's there to suppress growth. And then one way to gauge whether your program and the water quality conditions that you're maintaining is working is to measure for Legionella, right? Validate your plan through Legionella testing to validate that you're controlling and preventing the target hazard of concern from becoming a problem. And then, of course, documentation is everything. Now, I want to take a pause here and talk about cooling towers. Everything I've been talking about has been sort of potable water centric. Let's talk about cooling towers a little bit, and that there are specific things you need to be aware of. A lot of people that think that the cooling water treatment program, the chemistries that you add for corrosion control, scale control, and the biocides is all you need to do to mitigate Legionella. No, that is not true and not accurate. Maintaining these systems, while water treatment is important, that's there to maintain the operational efficiencies of these systems. To get to Legionella risk control and mitigation, you got to raise the bar to a public health perspective and standard. And there's other things you need to do. Have a water management plan in place. Specify regular cleaning and disinfection of the tower. How often are you going to test for Legionella? So there's more to it than just that. It's the mechanical, operational, and the chemical aspects to control to that health standard. All right, we're at the fifth element here is what are your contingencies and corrective actions, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to intervene when control limits are not met? And I see this often overlooked in DIY plans, do-it-yourself plans. They don't establish action plans for how to manage and take corrective actions. And then they don't establish the written procedures you're going to follow for how a corrective action is exceeded or how a limit may be exceeded. And it can be a hierarchy of control of do these actions for a low-level excursion versus something that's a higher-level excursion. So you want to have these things spelled out in your plan so you're not left guessing on what to do. And finally, we get to elements 6 and 7. These kind of go together. It's around reviewing the program on a regular basis and documenting, communicating, and adjust, right? This is not something you just create, put into action, sit it up on a shelf, and never revisit it. You really should reassess your situation every 3 to 5 years. You need to do annual reviews to verify, hey, are we doing what we said we would do per the plan? And validation is the program actually working, reviewing the data and the evidence that the plan is controlling the hazard of concern. So in summary, implementation of a plan can seem very daunting, and it does take time, right? Don't try to implement everything all at once. Ease into it, do the easy things first, and then get into your program and establish it. It takes a multidisciplinary team. Don't overlook the fact that you may need other disciplines in your organization to help you implement and follow the program. For example, in healthcare, you may need environmental services. They're going to have a role. If you're in hospitality, housekeeping can have a role as well. And also don't overlook the need for partnering with an industry expert such as us, Nalco Water. Look, I've been doing this for over 25 years. I have probably done well over 1,200 plans in my career. We've seen a thing or two. We can help bring that perspective to you to shorten the timeline for implementation and overcoming hurdles. So with that, I think we have some questions.
Yes, we do. So thanks. I'll come up here with Eric. And so I just want to recap. We had a couple, different topics, right? We talked about the legislation, right? The legislation is very broad. It's not specific, which is good for the building owner, right? This allows you time. You look at what that water management plan entails, and it gives you plenty of time to document your assets, to document your control measures, to document, with the testing frequency, all following that ASHRAE 188 standard. And also I want to reiterate, you talked about health versus performance. And that's really that biocide program or that traditional water treatment program, right? That is built all based on performance solutions, right? Getting to reusing the water as much as possible, keeping good heat transfer. That's the performance practice for a cooling tower. When you add to that the health perspective, you have to do more things. And that's really this legislation is driving to follow that ASHRAE model and what additional things would come with that, which are, typically the best practices of online disinfections, offline disinfections, increased frequency of that Legionella pathogen, and other monitoring, temperatures, pH, things like that. So Eric, thank you for the overview on the water management program. We did have some questions that were submitted ahead of time. I put a few more in as we were going along. So we'll go into the slides. I guess I'll just read them and we'll talk through each of the questions. And as a reminder, if you do have additional questions, please submit them. I'll check at the end here as we go through to see if there's been any additional questions submitted. That is a button at the top of your screen. So the first question is, would the new regulations apply to my refinery, right? We talk a lot about buildings and small things like that, but does it apply to a refinery?
Absolutely does. So you probably operate cooling towers. You probably have shower facilities and locker rooms for employee use. So I would say, yes, it definitely applies to a refinery. Now, when it comes to cooling towers and refineries, just like in a power plant, you have very large systems.
Yeah.
So the approach for maintaining and disinfecting those systems when they're only shut down, once every 3-5 years maybe? So a different strategy and a different approach, but yes, it would apply.
Yeah, it's a really good point because in New Brunswick, right, there was some legislation that mandated a specific shutting down of the cooling towers. And we worked with industry, worked with the legislation or legislators there. And so if you have a unique situation where that cooling tower must run 24/7 and cannot be shut down, there is a process in which you can communicate with the DEP or DOH, right? That is whoever's behind the legislation and enforcement. And you can look for those kind of alternative methods where you would replace an offline cooling tower cleaning with another online, right? So there's ways that we've helped our customers approach that and speak with those entities to get those kind of unique exceptions. Yeah. Okay. So, and one other point, I think when it comes down to, does it apply to me? I think also, if you look at those 5 at-risk water systems, it really comes down to whether you have one of those or you don't.
That's right.
If you have one of those at-risk water systems, you're going to be required to have a water management program based on 188. Is there an existing SOP for a water program that can be adapted to fit my site? So I think, the SOP it's not so much a standard operating procedure. I think we defined it as the water management program. That is really your SOP. So that has specific, call it topics or principles inside of 188 that you must have inside of your water management program that really defines that risk reduction approach that the legislation is getting at.
And I think I'd add to that I understand the term SOP, and that's a common industry term. You might have multiple SOPs supporting a program. So really it's a program approach and various SOPs around what's a procedure for cleaning and disinfecting a cooling tower? What's my SOP for that?
Sure.
Or what's my SOP for some other activity?
How does Legionella get into our water supply? I think you talked about that.
I think I covered that. So it can come in multiple ways through our municipal water supply. When it comes to a cooling tower, it can be blown in by the wind-blown dust, right? Legionella can be airborne, passes into your cooling tower, which is an excellent air scrubber. And so that's the other route for that type of system.
What can we do to prevent Legionella from contaminating the water supply?
It's hard. It's going to get there. So you have to go under the assumption that we're not trying to boil the ocean. Water coming into our facilities from a city water supply is not sterile, not intended to be. That'd be an unrealistic expectation. So the way to prevent it is to manage it from an engineering point of view. How do we mitigate it and prevent it from having the right conditions where it can grow? And to understand how it spreads. We can't prevent people from taking showers. We're not going to put a box around cooling towers because that would defeat the purpose of those types of systems. So we can figure this out through a water management program.
Yeah, and I think it's when we say prevention, a lot of people think, right, there is a way to eliminate Legionella. There's no approach to eliminating it unless you remove that water system. If you have a decorative fountain, I could eliminate that decorative fountain. That eliminates the risk.
Right.
But from a water supply, it's impossible to say that I can eliminate it completely because of the way these water systems operate and the way contamination can get into a facility, whether through potable water, right? We talk about municipalities, they're not sending sterile water to facilities, right? They're allowed to have a certain amount of bacteria in that. What percentage of that bacteria could it be Legionella? Well, it could get through, right? They're not providing sterile water. So I think having that mindset of trying to reduce risk to its lowest level is the best approach and intention.
Yeah. And hearing you give that answer, I thought of something about CDC, right? Effective water management programs. If you have an effective water management programs, I think they stated something around 90% of the outbreaks could have been prevented.
Yeah, right. What should we be looking for, and how often should we be checking for contaminants? I think that goes back to the water management program. Can you give maybe a couple examples of what a sampling plan or a testing plan might be inside of a water management program?
Yeah, it gets back to, we did the process line diagram and we say identify where the points of hazards can be potentially. So where can exposure occur? Where can stagnation occur? You got to manage those things and be aware of them. But what you can look for is stagnation, dead legs, points of contamination, and then how you're going to monitor those: water temperature, chlorine residuals, all, and certainly around cooling tower, all the things that you need to do to make sure that your water treatments are applied correctly and doing the job.
Yeah, and inside of those water management programs, you've got your remediation steps, right? If something goes above a control limit that requires a higher level of remediation, you have those practices also in place, right? So not only are you monitoring, right, those key leading indicators, but then also, right, in your plan, if something triggers or surpasses a limit that gets into kind of more of a dangerous level, you actually have remediation practices inside of that water management program.
Yeah, and then to add on about how often, sort of frequency of testing, it depends on the water quality parameter that you're monitoring, but typically, let's say you're doing Legionella testing, I'd recommend quarterly. Annual testing is practically meaningless because it's a snapshot in time once a year. And in water temperatures and chlorine residuals, quarterly at minimum, monthly would be better. And then for temperatures, when it comes to a hot water system and making sure it's delivering water at the right temperatures, I see organizations do it from once per shift per day to once a day to weekly.
And trending that information obviously provides tremendous insight. So
yeah, why collect the data and not look at it?
Yeah. And what are the testing requirements? So I think this question, when I read this, I threw it in here, and I apologize for the shortness of the question, but I think the question is around the legislation, right? Senate Bill 2188. What is the testing requirements of that bill? And there are no testing requirements that are explicitly stated. What they talk about is building that water management program, which inside that plan, you develop your kind of verification and kind of leading indicators and what you want to test. And you heard from Eric kind of that frequency and what parameters or contaminants you might measure. So it really comes down to that building owner with the type of at-risk water system you have and what is the right best practice or industry accepted practice for that type of water system. And that's how you build your water management program.
And that's consistent with 188 guidance, even CDC guidance. It's at the discretion of the management team, right? So, but it's one way, it's a great way to validate your program.
And what is the impact of Senate Bill 2188 on testing costs and frequency of testing? So another question here. Again, from a cost standpoint, it's hard to say, right? Depends on how many at-risk water systems you have. What's the frequency of testing? Quarterly testing, okay, there's 4 tests per year. But if you have a positive test, you might be coming back to retest, right? To see if any kind of remediation that you did, you may have to have a follow-up test, right? Those are typically industry best practices. So it's hard to talk about cost because it all depends on your facility, your number of at-risk water systems, and the complexity. Where do you see regulations acting on Legionella in the next 5 to 10 years?
Where do I see regulations acting on Legionella in the next 5-10 years?
Well, I'll comment on it.
Yeah,
right?
go ahead.
So I know the landscape of North America. We're seeing regulations increase, across the U.S. Right? Yeah. We've seen stuff in Canada. Vancouver has legislation. New Brunswick. We've got Virginia school districts have legislation. Louisiana has legislation. There's Department of Health in California are looking at legislation. So it's popping. I think what you're seeing is very similar to what one of my first slides I put up about regulations where are becoming more habitual, like seatbelt laws, right? What you're seeing is this wave of legislation around Legionella because it's a reportable disease and focusing on improving public health. So I think we're going to see more of it. I don't think it's going away. it's only going to grow. And, it's probably going to grow a lot from the Northeast towards central the US just because of the amount around New York City, New York State, now New Jersey, right? New Brunswick. You're seeing that Northeast corridor really driving legislation and being first. And I see other states kind of learning from that and seeing that it's the right approach. So that's my thought there. Another question. I've seen concerns presence with dead legs in systems being a source of Legionella as well. Shouldn't these also be captured in the process flow diagram creation?
Yeah, so I understand the question. So would you want to capture those in your process line diagram? It depends on how complex you want to make your diagram. I would advise that you keep it simple and instead list out where those locations are. And really, dead legs, if they can be removed, should be removed. But otherwise, those are going to be part of what we call a dead leg or a stagnant area flushing plan. So within the document, we're going to identify through the process of going through an assessment of where those are. Now, you're not going to find them all unless you just happen to know them all. But it's easier to list them out in a simple list than trying to put them all onto the line diagram. Unless, of course, it's a cross connect, right? That's an obvious one you'd want on the diagram because you want to show how those two systems are being tied together. Because if that cross connect's normally closed, that's a dead leg.
So another question is, will the state define Legionella testing, either frequency or anything like that? Do you foresee that happening?
Right now, it's not defined, and I think they're going to try to be consistent with what other areas of the country have done and probably not specify that, which is what I would prefer. The exception to that is New York State for cooling towers. It does stipulate, for cooling towers at least, that you do it quarterly, every 90 days while the system's in operation. Will they go down that path? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, and there's one more final question, and I'll just come into the camera here to kind of close out. The question was about, does NALCO provide or will NALCO provide water management plant services like New York City, but altered to New Jersey? So absolutely, right? I think the key here is that what the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection did was created a very broad legislation to start with. What you're going to see probably is they're going to see how the testing frequency, the positivity, the results as it comes into that portal or then into their repository database, and start to see how well the water systems are being managed.
Yeah.
Right now, there's not a unique New Jersey water management program that is required. It is simply the U.S. standard, ASHRAE Standard 188, those 7 principles. So there's nothing unique between New Jersey and I'll call it outside of New York City. It's really the industry best practice. So that's good. That helps all building owners, facilities, because it's kind of a standardized approach. But you really need those key elements from water management program. Understand it, how to develop that kind of testing plan, validation plan. What about remediation? Those kinds of things. And everything is time bound in a water management program, right? Everything is required to be done in a timely manner. Otherwise, it's not reducing risk, right? Risk reduction strategies are 24/7 and don't take vacation, right?
Nope.
So exercising that muscle, getting your facility started with 24 months, and really now we're down to 23, 22 months based on this when it was passed. So action is to start now, right? To start to build that routine habit of testing and understanding what the information is providing you as you get those results.
Yeah.
And that was the last question that was submitted. So with that, Eric, I'd like to thank you for presenting. Thank you everyone that has turned out on the line here today. Thank you for hanging with us in the Customer Experience Center. And with that, look forward to any kind of comments. If you want to submit additional questions after this, please don't hesitate. Reach out to any local NALCO contacts for further support. And we'll look forward to you next time in another topic around water safety. So thank you, everyone. Take care.